You are listening to Season 1 of Podcast, produced by the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center, the research department at the Institute of Contemporary Art Miami. For today's dispatch, we welcome Dr. Andrea Queeley, Associate Professor of Anthropology and African American Studies at Florida International University. Her research looks at the intricate ways in which diasporic subjectivities deal with globalized structural inequalities. Dr. Queeley's lecture focuses on the work of Afro-Cuban filmmaker Gloria Rolando. Using her work as a starting point, Dr. Queeley traces a long history of fraught race relations in Cuba and the innovative modes of expression that have flourished nonetheless. The lecture was originally delivered on October 5, 2019, as the culmination of week-long seminars with local students. A quick reminder before we begin to subscribe to IC Miami's YouTube channel for future podcasts, artist stories, lectures, performances, and more. Thanks for listening. Enjoy our latest episode of Podcasts by ARC.
In thinking about this presentation, I wanted to first ask whether or not folks, or if you could raise your hand if you're familiar with Gloria Rolando at all. Okay, so if you, good, okay, so I love it when I'm introducing her to new audiences, so this is great. And one of the reasons why I call this talk the Antidote to Anti-Blackness is because I'm really looking at what are some of the ways that, in this case, particularly Cubans, Black Cubans, are reinventing or are challenging anti-Blackness and acknowledging anti-Blackness in a context in which acknowledging that anti-Blackness and racism exist can be problematic, right? So I'm also thinking about, obviously this is an artist space where this is, how is it that artists and cultural workers, intellectuals, activists are really challenging and undermining anti-Blackness? So that's the kind of where this comes from. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Gloria's work, so visionary Afro-Cuban filmmaker, Gloria Rolando has broken many silences through her work, which in centering the experiences and interconnectedness, some water here, of African descendant people intervenes upon the profoundly racist representations of Black people that populate Cuban media, as well as this quote unquote single story of the African as ingredient in the Cuban ayaco. Her films are a declaration that not only do Black lives matter, but so do the ways in which those lives are represented and remembered. This paper understands Rolando's work with its employment of an aesthetic of Black dignity, confrontation with the racist gaze, and illumination of the multiplicity of Blackness to be an antidote to a toxic visual economy that renders Black life as exploitable and disposable through representing that life as less than human. So as you'll note from this slide, I don't think I actually have this on here, but she and Sara Gomez are the only Black women members of ICAEC, and Sara Gomez is deceased. And it always strikes me how little known Gloria is, and how profound her contribution is actually to Cuban cinema and African diaspora cinema. But so Gloria was born in 1953, et cetera, you can all read that, but the majority of her films are documentaries. She does documentary work, and she has one feature film that I'll talk a little bit about in this presentation today. And she's right now, and actually she came to Miami and we hosted her, this is a few years back, to show her film that looks at Haitian relationship and migration between Haiti and Cuba. And very classic Gloria, she was like, okay, so I'm looking for photographs of women's hands, of Black women's hands, so that, because for my next film, which is Diálogo con mi abuela, dialogue with my grandmother, I want to have all of these close-ups of Black women's hands. She's always working on that next project, and their next project is actually on the Hermanas de Oblate, I forgot how you say it in Spanish, del Corazón. So about the Oblate sisters, so that's Order of Black Nuns that she's still raising money for and working on. So the films that I'm focusing on now, I'm actually exploring themes of migration, memory, and the Black body, and I'm drawing upon two films that she made about the 1912 massacre. Raise your hand if you know about the 1912 massacre in Cuba. Raise your hand if you've heard about the race war in Cuba in 1912. Okay. So she did one film, so Voces para un Silencio, which is a three-part film or series. So there's 3 different chapters, and we're going to actually screen the first chapter. And I'm going to show a clip of a little bit of that one. And then she did also another film, which is her only feature film, on the 1912 massacre Raíces de mi Corazón. And then she does 3 films that I'm looking at on inter-Caribbean migration. Los Hijos de Baraguá, My Footsteps in Baraguá, Pasajes del Corazón y Memoria, which the English, what is the English translation of it? It's like Cherished Memories, yeah, Cherished Island Memories. And then the Reembarque is Reshipment, about the Haitian-Cuban relation or migration between Haiti and Cuba. So I'm situating Rolando's films within the context of Cuba's fraught and frustrated national anti-racist project, considering the ways in which her work responds to, pushes forward, and reimagines that project beyond national boundaries through its calling upon and creation of diasporic space. Here, I'm not juxtaposing the national and the diasporic as mutually exclusive trajectories of belonging. Rather, I'm interested in their interdependence and simultaneity. And so, in her work, or actually, skipping forward a little bit. So, in her work on Black women's artistic production, literary theorist Flora González Madrí made the observation that, quote, the cultural erasures of Black self-representations were and continue to be considerable in the official Eurocentric conception of Cuban national culture, even at the end of the 20th century. González Madrí asked how Black women artists and intellectuals who have remained in Cuba, quote unquote, rescue the memory of their selves, their cultures, and their position in Cuban intellectual history, end quote. Here, González Madrí evokes the broader context of the revolutionary government's sordid history and perhaps inherently fraught relationship with artists and intellectuals, but also the predicament of Black women artists in particular who must mediate and or negotiate between the revolution's mandate to deny racism, particularly institutionalized racism, and their own desire and responsibility to tell the truth of their lives as Black women, which necessitates addressing the racism and sexism that they experience. The question is, how do they accomplish this? How does Gloria Orlando talk about race and racism without talking about race and racism, right? Oops. My little microphone just got disassembled. So how does she talk about race and racism without talking about race and racism, right? So what is the confrontation? How does the artist confront within this particular context? And I think that that Erica that's part of what you were getting at, right? Is that where do the conversations about race, where do the conversations about anti-Blackness, and I love Joie's description of the distinction between the two, right? Because I was also kind of struggling with how to think about anti-Blackness in relationship to racism, because the two are not the same, right? So this question of how is it that with the kind of premise, right, the national premise, or the premise of national identity is that there is no racism, right? That todos somos iguales, we're all equal, we're all Cubans, right? That's what the national ideology really suggests. And so how does one, as if you're a Cuban artist, support that in various ways, right? But then also depict your everyday realities as a Black woman, right? And the realities of your community. So that's one of the things that I'm kind of questioning and looking at. Right, so what I'm exploring in this paper is how this rescue work, what Madrí calls rescue work, that centers diaspora and self-consciously affirms Blackness, often through the aesthetic of Black dignity, is an implicit indictment of both the contemporary realities of anti-Blackness and the denial of such realities that lay at the very foundation of the nation. Indeed, as González Madrí contends, forgetting is a national project, right? So we have this. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I want to actually show you all first this clip from Voces para un Silencio. You can get a aesthetic feel for her work first.
Para el afro señor, el explotador, mirando sobre su hombro el color, ejército libertador, terrateniente, prejuicio, inicio, superior, vicio, inferior, a mi gente traición, engaño, supuesta liberación, luego de la independencia echados al montón, partido independientes de color, hombres, mujeres, niños, La Maya, Holguín, Santa Clara, matanza, masacre, desarmados en combate, ocultaron la historia, hoy la memoria vuelve al ataque, Cuba libre.
Cuento con lo que cuenta para decir lo que hace falta.
De verdad que no puedo identificar claramente en qué momento fue en que supe la historia de los independientes, ¿no? Sí puedo identificar más claramente el momento de mi ignorancia total. Y fue en una discusión que tuvimos espontáneamente en el patio de la Facultad de Psicología cuando yo estudiaba sobre la realidad de los negros en Cuba, sobre los problemas raciales que existían en Cuba en ese momento. Y bueno, ya yo empezaba ya con los intereses de trabajar en torno a la identidad y en torno a los problemas de la racialidad en Cuba, ¿no? Y de pronto asalta a alguien y me dice, bueno, pero ¿qué cosa es lo que han hecho los negros en este país?
¿Quién es usted que pone en tela de juicio mi procedencia?
¿Quién es usted?
¿Quién es usted que cuestiona mi decencia, integridad y apariencia?
¿Quién es usted?
¿Quién es usted que duda de mis capacidades y me niega virtudes que me salen a flor de
Aquellos
piel?
vientos trajeron estas tempestades. Así de pronto, un montón de cualidades cayó encima de mi raza. Y muchos fueron a pasar un curso de cómo no ser racistas. Se graduaron con honores y fiestas. Y hasta el sol de hoy permanecen ocultos en la frase esta: somos iguales todos los seres humanos. Escucha esto, Nicolás.
Yo.
Estoy rapeando al compás de mis pasas. Mi ñata, mi bemba, mi árbol genealógico, mi historia, mis costumbres, mi religión y mi forma de pensar.
So as you might have noted, one of the visual turned ideological or interpretive strategies that Gloria uses in her work is superimposition in a way that leads the viewer to consider the porous boundary between past, present, and future, to consider how the historical events recounted by survivors and narrated by primarily Black and Mestizo historians are embedded within the present. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with Cuban history, this is like, I call this Cuban 101, right? So Cuba was the second to last place in the Americas to abolish slavery, right? So Brazil was the final one, 1888, Cuba in 1886. So there was a series of 3 different wars for independence, right, from Spain, and also to abolish slavery. In those wars were actually multiracial in their for those who were fighting the wars were across the racial spectrum, the Cuban racial spectrum, and also not only were the foot soldiers, you know, men of color, and some women also were part of that. You also had folks in the higher ranks of the army, men of color in the higher ranks of the army, right? And so when they were talking about Maseo, so for those of you who don't know, Antonio Maseo is the general, and the most famous probably Black Cuban, who led the charge and who initiated the protests in Paraguay. So when the more white Cubans were basically came to signed a treaty in peace with Spain after the end of the 10 Years' War, he protested, right? And he said, no, because we're not, that in this treaty, the abolition of slavery is not included, right, as part of the deal, and we are here to actually be free. So he's a kind of symbol of resistance, but he was also one story that I like to tell about Maseo, and that a lot of people don't know, is that he's a celebrated general. He died in battle at the beginning of the Third War, right, the Cuban War for Independence, and 5 years after he died, I want to say, El Cráneo de Maseo was published, I think, in like 1908 or something like that. But they essentially they exhumed his body, right? So how dishonoring, right, can you be? They exhumed his body in order to examine, at this time, you know, you have the height of racial science, to examine whether or not he was, would be considered to be European, so was he white or Negro, right? And they concluded that he had the body of a Negro but the brain of a white man, conveniently. So that's how they treated Maseo. But in any event, so these multiracial wars for independence at the end of the 19th century, mid to the end of the 19th century, if you contrast that with what was going on in the United States and in other spaces, you don't have this kind of Black participation, right, in the nation building project. And so Cuba is unique in the sense that its understanding of itself as a nation, right, is really rooted in this kind of a multiracial fraternity, right, and this idea of people men across ethnic and racial identities moving in battle to create a nation, right? So this idea, of course, for those of you who know, Jose Marti famously said, Cubans are more than white, more than Black, more than mulatto, right? So yes, you have this discourse of racial fraternity and racelessness, and that denies exclusion. So, and I'm leading up to how it is, what the quote-unquote race war, the massacre of 1912 was about. So, similar to what is happening now, because you have these, again, resonances between past and the present, there's this discourse of racelessness, this discourse of racial equality and fraternity, but the reality, the lived reality of Black people is quite different and doesn't bear out, right? And so the protests, even after the triumph, or especially after the victory against Spain, really continued, in part because you had Cuban racism at work, and then you also had the US that came in 1898 and established and fomented and supported, right, again, that kind of homegrown anti-Blackness in Cuba to denigrate, exclude those Black, even those Black, especially war heroes, right? So folks who had fought for the liberation of the country were excluded from jobs, they were excluded from physical social spaces, right? And so they gathered together and or try to organize their own political party, right? The Independent Party of Color, which was met with tremendous resistance, of course, because why would you need an Independent Party of Color when there's no racism and we're all one? Everybody is equal, right? So part of that denial of anti-Blackness that Bourgeois and Erica were talking about, you really see manifested in this particular moment within Cuban history, right? And so you even have a Black congressman actually who passes the Marua law, who passes a law that bans race-based political parties. And so this essentially outlaws the Independent Party of Color. They protest against this and then are mercilessly brought down, right, by militia and the army. So in what Nasi Morajon says, una matanza y no una guerra. So it was a massacre, not a war, right? So this idea, and if you notice in the captions for some of the newspaper clips, you know, the idea of, well, there's these Blacks against whites, right? And this idea of the Haitian Revolution and this fear of this uprising, this fear that we are essentially, you know, I interpret this as a fear of retribution, right? And so the sense that eventually, because we know we have done so wrong, Black people are going to rise up and they are going to give us a little taste of our own medicine. So you have this really tremendous war of terror, essentially, that lasted, I want to say, like 5 or 6 days, in which anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 people were murdered, right? And that one clip where the gentleman who was being interviewed says, my grandfather was going to get some charcoal and then he never came back. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't involved in the Independent Party of Color. He was just massacred because they were just massacring Black people. And that's part of the legacy, right, of terror that folks, and within people's families that folks are dealing with. But so you have, so it's a matanza no una guerra, and there's an opposition to self-conscious Blackness. And that's also a point that I wanted to make and for us to talk about, right? So this idea, or the movement, the ethos of anti-Blackness, there are particular kinds of Blacknesses that are more dangerous and more subjected to brutalization than others, right? So in this instance, what is more offensive or unheard of, right, is the assertion of an affirmative Blackness, is the assertion of a sense of power and an empowered Blackness, which is why the Haitian Revolution, of course, has such power and has been there has been this vector of the Haitian Revolution, right? So it's not just a Black uprising. It's about actually Black people assuming power and authority. So you have, let's see. So this film obviously undermines the myth of racial equality, right? I hope you guys got that. And it also, again, sheds light on what is going on in the present, right? So by elaborating upon and really breaking the silence around the 1912 massacre, there's also this question that she's posing implicitly, right? Is that, and this is part of what she's doing, I argue, in terms of visually, right, in making the past part of the present, is to make a commentary on what actually is going on in the present, and the ways that anti-Blackness and Black experiences are silenced in the present, right? And also that this confronting the myth of racial democracy, racial fraternity, et cetera, and also this question of language and the definition of what racism is, right? So racismo, racism, is associated with US-style segregation, right? So if you ask somebody, well, is there racism? No, because there isn't that US-style racial segregation. If you say, like, is there discrimination against black people? Well, yeah, there is. So it's a kind of interesting dynamic, historically rooted, obviously. And so there's also what she's doing in this film, and again, we're gonna screen the full film after my talk, is really also making these connections across the diaspora, right? And so this particular segment of the film is, I don't know if you all are familiar with this image, but this is within the United States, a lynching that took place in the United States, and they made postcards and circulated those images and all of that. So that's one of them. And she features African-American historians who narrate the connection between Black Americans and Black Cubans in the late 19th to early 20th century, to show the Black world in which the 1912 massacre occurred. For instance, one of the interviewees points out that the U.S. 1898 intervention in Cuba was the first time Black troops participated in overseas action, and contrasts the Cuban ideal of interracial fraternity with what was going on in the U.S., like Plessy versus Ferguson, Jim Crow segregation, lynching epidemic, etc. But Gloria also chooses to use gospel music and images of the turn of the century African America to argue for this interconnectedness, right? So she's always kind of consciously asserting and causing us to, asserting and really challenging kind of Cuban uniqueness, or the idea of Cuba as being a multiracial space of equality, right? So, that's part of what she's doing in that segment. Another piece that she draws upon, or strategies that she uses, or ways that she challenges this kind of historical basis of the ideology of racial equality, is through this laying bare of the brutality that was exacted on the Black body. And she shows one clip as triumphant white officers and Black congressmen and military who are culpable in the slaughter. Indeed, at one point in the film, the camera settles on the names of the military, of Black congressmen rather, underlined in red in the newspaper, and the faces of Black members of the military campaign, leaving an unasked question: why would they participate in this massacre of other Black people, as well as the statement, Black people participate in the political and physical annihilation of other Black people. So the images of brutality are juxtaposed with images of these men in life, these men being, so Pedro Ivanet was one of the architects, one of the leaders of the Independent Party of Color. And as we see this, the use of the Black body and the display, right, as Erica was talking about the cutting off of the heads and displaying them on stakes, there was this way of asserting, right, the domination. And so she takes those images from the archives and inserts them into her films to say, look, these are people. This is what happened. This is the way in which their bodies were treated. And this segment is followed by these conversations and interviews with the grandchildren and the family members of these people who were brutally murdered. So, as I was saying, the images of brutality are juxtaposed with images of these men in life and stories of their connection to family. Again, the close-ups of the faces, particularly the eyes of contemporary Black Cubans, and also the images in newspapers, particularly when superimposed, bring the atrocity of the past into the present. Breaking the silence of the past, this is the other leader, is a vehicle for breaking the silence of the present. It is a direct confrontation of the dominant ideology and still widespread belief that todos somos iguales, we're all Cubans, racism doesn't exist, and to shine a light on discrimination is anti-Cuban and racist itself. So the same dynamic from the Republican period has been replicated in revolutionary rhetoric. And this is a representation of Black dignity, which I'll get into a little bit later too. Okay, so moving on to the post-1959 and then the post-1989 periods. So, as actually, Erica, I'm like, you already did the work for me, so I don't actually have to go into all of this, but just as an overview. So you have, and I wanted to lay out that kind of 19th and early 20th century context in order to understand the 1959 revolution, right? And so specifically with regards to race. So the discourse or the 1959 revolution is that it is an actual, the actual revolution, the actual freedom of Cuba was circumvented, right, both by US intervention and Cuban elite. and that the revolution is the realization of the Cuban Wars for Independence, right? The actualization of the Cuban Wars for Independence. And so with that, there's also this assertion that racism, right, is a target. So eliminating racism is an objective, a stated objective of the revolution, right? And so people talk to me about this, how this was this incredible moment where there was a desegregation, so an outlining of segregation in social spaces so that they could go walk into the middle of the park. So the ways that the central parks were organized was that whites could go in the middle, in the center of the parks, and then you had like mulattoes in the outer, or the kind of middle space, and then black people could like be outside, right? And so there's this, I think if you think about the spatial economy of racism and how it operated, and how it manifests itself in the environment, that's one example that folks talk about a lot. Being able, we talked about the swimming pool thing, right? Being able to go down to the beaches, having access. It was a major, symbolic victory, and one that signaled that the revolution really did have a truly anti-racist agenda. And it's a Marxist revolution. The idea that if you dismantle class structures, then you really get rid of racism, right? Happens in a couple of years. Fidel says, oh, there's no racism here, right? And then represses those people who say, no, actually, there is racism. So removal of barriers, and again, the significance of it really cannot be underestimated. But the declaration of that there's no race presents all kinds of problems. So the question is, if you can't publicly speak about race without being sanctioned, then where do those conversations happen, right? And so fast forward to after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have, there's a lot to say about that, but there's an argument that there was a resurgence of racism, right? And the resurgence of racism was based on what? It was based on the fact that the dollar was legalized, right? And so there's the number of remittances that came into Cuba in order to help folks there happened in a pattern such that you had black Cubans excluded from receiving those funds because the majority of people who left Cuba were socially white, right? And then also with the rise of tourism, as Erica was talking about, so tourist spaces were for obviously foreigners, right, who are overwhelmingly white, and then also for Cubans who could pass, lighter-skinned Cubans who could pass, or for women mostly of color who were seen as being sex workers, right, ajineteros. And and Cubans couldn't actually legally, until the rule changed this, I want to say in like 2012, but couldn't enter into hotels, right? And so you have this, tourist apartheid that was very much racialized. So you have this kind of reassertion of those patterns that people were so excited about being free of, right, with the revolution. And again, so the economic disparities and the consequences of attitudes. So for instance, who's going to have access to the good jobs in the tourist industry and that pay in foreign currency, right? The policy, the unwritten policy, right, was that lighter-skinned Cubans, whiter Cubans, have buena presencia, right, a good presence, so that appearance. So if you don't have a good appearance, then you can't really work with tourists. And if good appearance is defined through, in Portuguese, what is it in Portuguese? Buena presencia. So that policy, right, does what? It excludes darker-skinned people from being in jobs where they're going to make, have access to tourists and access to the money, and then there's an extent to which blackness itself is, of course, criminalized when in association with any tourist, right? And I had the same experience walking into a club or walking into this area that is specifically identified as being a tourist area and being asked for my carnet, my identity card, right? So I was automatically read as Cuban. There are other instances that happened, which was very enlightening. So Cubans subjected to systematic discrimination, and of course in the media is a prime example. So who has watched Cuban television? Okay, so in the Cuban soap operas, the novelas, what is your experience of race and racialization within the Cuban media? Mm-hmm. I was startled when I first started going to Cuba and watching the novelas at the kind of blatant, what I saw as the blatant, minstrelsy, right? Or thinly veiled minstrelsy, really. And then when I had conversations with people about it, some people said, yeah, I guess that is probably pretty bad. And then other people trying to kind of rationalize it, like, oh, well, it's because it's a period piece. Or, oh, it's because, this is how it really is, that they don't, this is the role that they would. I mean, just to the point where one character, remember, she had her, like, braids akimbo, and she looked like depictions of pickaninnies, right, that we're familiar with. So yes, the media is one area, right, and representation is one area in which we see this, systemic discrimination asserted. And yes, and the within the context, and Gloria talks about this, within the context of tourism, if you've been to Cuba, you have probably seen the dolls that are all over the place, right? I would call them mammy dolls, or they're blackface dolls, right, with the dark skin and red lips and big eyes and all of that. And so there's kind of this recycling of these racist tropes for the consumption of Cubans and foreigners. So here are some. Right? And they're not specific to Cuba, right? We see these in other spaces. If you've seen the series of Black and Latin America series in the Dominican Republic, Skip goes to one of these places in Santo Domingo. Yeah, this is one of my favorite Gloria quotes. So one of my strongest reflections is that the image I have of my grandmother, they have tried to destroy it many times, and I have no doubt of this. Why? Because tourism has risen in Cuba, and what is the image of Black people? These horrible dolls. Why, if here, there have existed Black leaders, very dignified men and women, why this representation? We've had a brilliant Cuban history of Black leaders and intellectuals, so why now, for the tourist industry, do they bring out these representations that are so denigrating? So artists, intellectuals, and activists created an alternative narrative to address the economic position of Blacks and mestizos in the new economy. The first film that Gloria directed, Africa's Ogun, was released in 1991 at the onset of the special period. Her work must be placed within this context. One of the predicaments of Black artists and intellectuals is how to affirm the revolution's ideals and early actions to combat inequality while still honoring the truth of their daily experience and the systematic devaluing of that which is associated with Blackness and Africanity, evident in the daily diet of racist jokes and images, as well as hiring and promotion practices, and the silencing of Black and mestizo contributions to the nation in the teaching and telling of history. So here's some representations, that's what I was referring to. So you see these all over the place. And yes, Cuba did have minstrelsy theater, so teatro bufo, or blackface theater. So I have a couple of thoughts. One, to go back to Joie's framework, right, of looking at anti-Blackness and point about anti-Blackness as something that is a kind of globalized phenomenon that is birthed or part of the birthing of the quote-unquote modern world, right? Such that Black people have internalized, everybody has internalized this, regime, right, of anti-Blackness. And so the question is, what are the multiple ways in which it manifests itself, right? And what are the meanings in this kind of, reclamation of particular facets of cultural identity or expression, and where's the line between kind of that, of course, authenticity is problematized, but this idea of it being not for the performance for another, right? Not this kind of process of self-objectification. So in what spaces is that allowed, or does that occur? And then in what spaces does a kind of objectification, commodification, and performing for the other occur? So I think and I think that's part of what Pat was getting at, is that it's not an either or. And I have this quote by Alden Knight, who actually is a Jamaican-Cuban actor, and where he is, so exposing kind of this absence, right? And it's not just an absence. So I've never seen my kind of Black family, right? Represented on Cuban TV, a family that made a concerted effort to move on from living in one room to an apartment, to a large house through its own efforts. Nothing was ever handed to us. So the subtext of this is that Black people are loyal to the revolution and should be loyal to the revolution because they didn't have anything before, and the revolution gave them everything that they had, right? So he's speaking to that. I don't see the Black Cuban intellectual represented. They've never put the Blacks of the globalized on TV. It's as if they never existed. Where are our writers who are writing about our lives? Do they exist? I believe they do. Is their work accepted? There lies the problem. That's where the problem lies. I like there lies the problem better. So though Jamaican Cuban actor Alden Knight shared this commentary over 20 years ago, the denigration of blackness, in part through the invisibility of black diversity, which is one way to deny black humanity, is an ongoing problem in the realm of the aesthetic. As such, one of the first silences or erasures Rolando intervened upon is one that enables the myth of black cultural homogeneity. I'm particularly interested in the sensory as a route to the production of knowledge. I've moved between and connected the words silence and erasure to signal the power of both the sonic and the visual in Gloria's documentaries. Silence is broken through music, the voices of our interlocutors, and also the sounds of the natural world, while the visual erasure is undone through stills of archival material such as newspaper articles and photographs that are the tangible documents testifying to black existence and experiences. Most powerfully, erasure is undone by the way the camera lingers on the faces and hands of the history makers, compelling the viewer to study them, to recognize their humanity. Thus, Rolando intervenes upon anti-blackness without directly confronting or calling out anti-blackness through the particular representational strategies she employs, as well as the topics she tackles. Both of these are rescue work. And this is still from Raíces de mi Corazón. And so in one of the films on the 1912 massacre, in addition to portraying the black body as violated, remembering the black body is a cornerstone of this rescue work. So this image is from, as I said, Raíces de mi Corazón, and this is Mercedes. And so the story is that she's a young journalist, and she's trying to find a story that would be interesting, but she has to kind of appease her white female boss. And so she wants to write a story about her family, right? Because she's having all of these dreams where her grandmothers are coming to her, and her grandfather actually was murdered in the massacre. This is part of the story. And so she wants to write a story of substance, and her boss says, well, no, why don't you write something about like fashion, right? So she's kind of this dismissive tone, right? And in another, piece of this film, the story kind of unfolds, and it unfolds through Mercedes' dreams and through her conversations with her family. So here we have Maria Victoria and Jose Julian, Mercedes' grandparents. Jose Julian went off to join the struggle for equality and justice, spearheaded by the Independent Party of Color. However, before he left, he proposes to Maria Victoria, they make love, and she becomes pregnant. So when he doesn't return because he's been murdered in the massacre, she, Mercedes' mother, and family are left in pain, loss, and silence, brought on by fear and shame. With its extended shots depicting love and physical intimacy between heterosexual black bodies marked by respectability, this film is a self-consciously humanizing blackness, or self-consciously humanizes blackness through representations of black sexuality that are radically different from those that populate the visual landscape. And so at this point, I want to turn to Gloria's documentaries on Black Cuban Caribbean diasporic experience that focus on inter-Caribbean migration and the ways that she breaks silences and erasures by foregrounding the voices and images of these makers of history who declare that, yes, this happened and we are here. So some of you may be familiar with this wonderful Haitian anthropologist, Michele Trio. He passed away, oh God, it's probably been 10 years by now, 10 or 12 years. So one of the most enduring legacies of Haitian anthropologist Michele Trio lays in his classic text, Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. His traversing of history's circuitous routes offers the insight that the dynamic nature of history's telling inadvertently gives voice to deeply embedded inequalities, which is the history that is silenced in its own telling. As he writes, quote, the ways in which what happened and that which is said to have happened are and are not the same may itself be historical. Trio refers to the Society of King Christophe's Friends, a small intellectual fraternity that included Aimé Césaire and Alejo Carpentier, as the quote-unquote playwrights, novelists, and historians who were the alchemists of history, and writes that, quote, we all need histories that no history book can tell, but they are not in the classroom, not in the history classrooms anyway. They are in the lessons we learn at home, in poetry and childhood games, in what is left of history when we close the history books with their verifiable facts. So Rolando, who certainly belongs in the pantheon of Caribbean alchemists of memory, shows us what is left of history by taking us into the homes, fields, work, and play spaces, and through recollection, the childhoods of the unsung protagonists of Caribbean history. And so this is another quote, Rolando quote, where she's, situating Cuba within the Caribbean. Actually, I have had students say that they didn't think that Cuba was part of the Caribbean, right? And in part because of the conceptualization of the Caribbean, and then also the way in which they think of Cuba, which is racialized, right? So the Caribbean is black and Cuba is white. That's essentially how it oftentimes breaks down, right? And Gloria, so Cuba's a Caribbean island, it's a Caribbean country. We share the destiny of many other Caribbean islands, for example, migration. After the Panama Canal was finished, Cuba was a destination. And so she talks about this fascination she had with why does some Cubans, black Cubans, have English names, right? What is the kind of the bond and the linkages between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean, right? And that this is not part of official history, right? So here we have Hijos de Baragua. So in keeping with Trio's intervention, I'm concerned with memory and forgetting as mutually constitutive processes and the ways in which Rolando and her interlocutors, particularly those who migrated themselves or the children of those sojourners, might navigate this relationship in their telling of this history, right? And what I'm trying to get at really is how it is that, and this is, Trio's one of his great contributions, is this kind of what is happening in the untelling, right, of particular histories, and then how does that get reproduced? I mean, we understand how it gets reproduced kind of systematically, institutionally, through school systems, et cetera, but how does it also get reproduced within families, right? And so what are these, the folks who she interviews, what parts of the migration experience are being left out, right? What parts are being forgotten or dismissed? So anyway, okay, so I'll play just a little bit of Vishu Sabarawah.
Dicen los más viejos y aquellos que no pueden olvidar que por allá por los años 1920, 1930 iban y venían unos barquitos entre la isla de Pinos y las islas Caimán. Iban repletos del olor de los frutos de la tierra y el mar. También transportaban las noticias, las dulces melodías del Caribe, el calipso, el foxtrot, el round dance, pero sobre todo llevaban y traían las esperanzas de la gente. Ahora solo queda un barquito, aunque ya les digo, no es fácil verlo navegar, pero dicen los más viejos y aquellos que no quieren olvidar que la única carga que lleva es un pequeño cofre de donde se escapan de tiempo en tiempo las historias de cubanos y caimaneros.
So she, in many of her documentaries, she features these firsthand testimonials, and with the inter-Caribbean migration documentaries, they're of migrants or the children or grandchildren of migrants. And it obviously gives kind of this flesh to this unfolding story of the movement of people from Jamaica and Barbados, but also other English-speaking Caribbean islands, but also from Panama, as you saw, because that was one of the routes, was that folks, when the canal was getting done, they went to Cuba, which was the next destination. So, and part of what I am looking at is this kind of way in which she represents this layering of blackness and also in black histories. And so kind of giving this texture and to Black experience that is denied in the reduction of Blackness through the white supremacist project, right? And also memory is a character in her films, right? And it speaks its own truth. And you see these old photographs, you see this kind of dignity of these elders that she's interviewing. They're in their Sunday best, they're creating this aesthetic of Black dignity is what I call it. And she also has these close-up shots of people's faces as they're being interviewed. Also the close-up shots of the archival photographs. She's inviting and perhaps imploring the viewer to acknowledge Black humanity. And she reconstructs the world that the immigrants created in a way that both acknowledges the dominant representation of depraved Blackness and supports the Negro Fino narrative in which Anglophone Caribbean Cubans are perceived to occupy a different, elevated Blackness as compared to their Cuban and Haitian counterparts. And telling the stories of Black immigrants to Cuba and largely allowing them to tell their own stories through the centering of the testimonial illuminates the textures and layers of Black Cuba while also disrupting conceptualizations of Cubanidad that obscure the multiple routes of Blackness and Africanity. So a couple of points that I just want to end with, right? And so when we look at these films on inter-Caribbean migration, the centering of loss, right, and the kind of way in which loss is palpable in the narratives of the folks that she interviews is really something that I think is a kind of an aesthetic of displacement, right? That the way that there's a displacement, obviously, within these kind of migratory streams. There's a displacement from continental Africa through the transatlantic slave trade. There's a displacement for, there are all of these movements, right? Some of them forced and some of them not technically forced, but forced by circumstance. And it creates a kind of an overwhelming sense of loss, right? And so the part of the process of remembering is really coming to terms with and grappling with how to negotiate loss. And I'll end with what Ross was saying about anti-Blackness as being one of the ways to measure it is through loss of life, right? So having lower life expectancy, being more likely to lose your life because you are Black, right? Obviously, those people who are surviving, where there's loss in the loss of life, and also those people who are surviving are having to constantly grapple with loss. And so one of the things that I think that she does really beautifully, and that comes out in these films on inter-Caribbean migration, is kind of get that into our bones, right? And confront us with not only black humanity in terms of with the faces and all that, but also the way in which loss impacts our emotional, spiritual, and psychic health, right? And my argument or suggestion is the reason why this is an antidote, right, to anti-Blackness is that denial, because it breaks through this denial, and that the denial is really one of the things that allows this kind of mechanism to continue, right? Or is really a partner in it. So if we continue with these kinds of representations and continue with this kind of excavation of the emotional, of the many different facets, but particularly the emotional component of persecution of anti-Blackness, then we're, moving towards, in a way, or towards a reconciliation, or towards a survival, right, of it. So that's all. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went over time.
El 17 de febrero del año 1993, mi abuela Inocencia y yo nos sentamos a conversar. Era una de esas mañanas de invierno cubano y todos vivíamos en la casa de Obispo número 356 en La Habana Vieja. Mi abuela, ella era una persona muy conversadora y yo estaba dispuesta a grabar cualquier cosa que ella me quisiera contar. Pero ahora, después de 20 años, he decidido abrir las páginas de estas memorias que envuelven mi espíritu y también me dan el consuelo de una dulce compañía. es algo muy importante para mí. Y por eso los invito a que me acompañen en este diálogo con mi abuela.
Thank you for listening to podcasts produced by the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center at ICA Miami. Please be on the lookout for other dispatches from this series, future seasons of our podcast, and ebooks.